Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of December 1st, 2020. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined this week by Josh Blank, Research Director of the same Texas Politics Project, and we took last week off for Thanksgiving, for those of you that were looking for it.
Yeah, crickets.
I'm listening to the silence out there. Sorry there was no warning. I'm not really sure how we would have done that, but we're back after Thanksgiving. Some much needed rest on my part. I don't know about you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It started by not recording this last week.
Yeah, we started early on the rest. So this week, Josh and I kicked around a couple ideas going into this, but this morning I moderated a panel for the Professional Advocates Association of Texas, I believe, for Pat. And if you're out there and I've scrambled the two A's, I'm sorry to Jack and Allison and everybody over there, but I believe that's correct. And it was a kind of a pivot, as there will be many of these. It was a panel pivoting from the election to the coming legislative session here in Texas. Interestingly, we were able to tune in early, and what we want to use is a little bit of the hook here, even though we'll probably touch on some things that came up in that conversation that I had with Scott Braddock, Gromer Jeffers, and Ross Ramsey. Before our panel, the probably money shot for the participants there was Administration Chairman and longtime House Member Charlie Guerin, who talked quite a bit about the sort of state of discussion in preparation for the legislature to operate when they come back in session in January. And there was a lot of stuff that was interesting about this. Now, we should, say at the outset so as not to get Charlie in trouble, not that we're capable of getting Charlie in trouble, but to misrepresent the discussion.
When you say that, my heart beats fast. Just for
Representative
no
Guerin, I should say.
Yeah, Chairman Guerin, I believe.
Chairman Guerin, I believe. Yes. What we want to sort of underline here is that this was all sort of, an update on stages of discussions, and the chairman was very clear to say that there was no decisions had been made, but this is what they thought was going on. Some, obviously some preparations have been implemented in terms of some of the things we've seen at some of the committee hearings and meetings. But all that said, as an update on the state of discussions, there were a lot of things that really stuck out, I think. One was, I think the idea that in the House, at least, there would probably be mandatory testing for people that were going to, it sounded like, come in the chamber or come in, participate in the process, right?
Right. So, some kind of mandatory.
As I heard that.
The specifics of it, not necessarily clear yet.
Right.
You said in development.
I think another thing that struck out, and you and I were talking about how we were comparing this to some of the results that we saw in the survey that the House administration did, I think almost certainly in conjunction with the Speaker's office during the summer, in which I think about 3/4 of the members that responded to that survey said that they would support mandatory testing of members, to come into the building to be part of the process. But there were also, there's also a lot of discussion in what the chairman had to say about what limitations there would be. And it sounded like probably, I think the thing that was certainly in the panel that I then moderated made all the reporters prick up their ears was the fact that they would not be allowing press into the chamber or the back hall. Mm-hmm. And that the chamber and the back hall would likely, as I heard it, be open to members and limited staff only. Now,
yeah, I mean, maybe using that as like an impromptu members lounge or something. With more
using the back hall. Yeah, using the back hall for that way. And then it was a little unclear to me, and I think I need to go back and see if we can see that video. what, it seemed like the reporters had heard, and you and I didn't talk about this, that press might be able to get into the gallery, but not on the floor.
Well,
But
that
it
wasn't
sounded like
even
the
clear to
gallery,
me.
but I didn't hear that. I think Ross seemed to hear that, but I did not.
See, and I thought I heard the opposite. I thought I heard that they were actually going to keep the gallery clear, potentially even.
Right, and then it might be for
It might be
members
for press.
only. So we'll have to go back and check that.
I mean, the overarching thing here, I think, to point out is if you were going into this thinking, boy, is the Texas House going to take the approach of, it's the people's house, let everyone in, everybody take your own precautions, versus something more of a bubble-ish scenario, and it's not a bubble
Right.
at all, obviously, but something with a lot more rigor around it. It seems to be leaning much more towards the more rigorous approach to the pandemic.
Right.
Not the most rigorous, but a lot more rigorous than not, is what it's sounding like.
Yeah, I think that's right, and so I think that, and then another couple things that were interesting about that, I think, was that the use of technology. It sounds like everybody's getting a Chromebook, and that they are exploring the institutional slash constitutional
Slash
slash
technologically.
legal
Yeah.
space for members not voting from their desks.
Well, I think that's
essentially,
important.
or voting in the chamber.
He brought up something, I thought that was really just very crystal clear, which is, they don't want to get to the end, get through a budget certification, and then have somebody challenge the budget and have it be struck down as unconstitutional because of how they did it. But what that also tells you is that they're thinking about what are the extent of the limitations that are allowed under the Constitution that will allow them to practice the session safely. And that's really, again, in terms of orientation, I think that's telling you that's what the orientation of the House is right now. It's really about what are the boundary limits, not so much about like where do I get to some ideal point, normatively. Right.
Well, and I think Chairman Guerin raised the point that some substantial number of the members are 60 or older, so there are a lot of people at risk here.
Mm-hmm,
and I think all of that is halfway, not halfway. A lot of that is clearly reasonable and clearly the kind of public health considerations that we've been seeing elsewhere. I think it's interesting given, not to jump ahead, but, it's interesting given the public discussion and given the differential responses to the pandemic, shall we say, among different members, that when it, and I think we pointed this out when we looked at the survey, that when it, it comes to the chamber itself and to the members themselves, some of the public skepticism that we've seen about overreaction to the pandemic seems not quite as predominant, shall we say.
We'll put a pin in that.
I think that's fair. We can come to
that. Maybe we'll stick with the institution.
I think, yeah. So one of the things that we were noticing when we decided to talk about this is that, as tentative as this discussion is, it does raise the fact that there are a lot of institutional questions at play that are broached by the legislature's need to respond to the pandemic. And I think, this has been floating around out there for quite a while, but now that, the reasonable, if seemingly pessimistic predictions that we were going to have a worsening of the pandemic conditions in, winter and spring, in fall and winter have come to pass, it's really made these questions much more present and much more urgent. And, I think, as with a lot of stages of this pandemic, there's been a lot of periods where people say, well, maybe it'll get better. Well, it's not getting better.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not going to be in better, be better in time for the pandemic or for the session. So I think, among these institutional questions, what really stuck out to you? Take your pick.
Take my pick. Well, it's a tough one. I think, obviously the first one I would just say is, as someone who is not involved in the process personally myself, but as an observer of the process, I think about, what impact the lack of press access is going to look like on, I would just say our general public understanding of the process. I'd say mine, in some ways, although we have other people that we talk to kind of find out what's going on and learn about how, again, some of the inside machinations and things like that. But I think, generally, as someone who's really interested in sort of the public perception of the process and the public perception of, let's say, the ability of the legislature to address, the important issues that they're going to have to deal with, which we'll get to, this sort of press kind of being on the outside looking in, watching, the legislature from their couches over the Texas Leg live stream is, it's going to be interesting to see what effect that has. I mean, I think just in a global sense, in terms of like our overall understanding of the process, but also even the breadth of coverage. I mean, ultimately, are we going to see a lot more? We call that like herding in journalism. Essentially this idea that we're going to cover. If somebody covers a story, we're all going to cover this story. I wonder if there's not going to be more of that, given on the one hand, maybe a smaller agenda, maybe, but we'll get to that. But on the other hand, again, this lessened access. I don't know. What about you?
Well, as you know, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are interesting here. One of the things I said in the panel for Pat was that, I mean, as I was sitting and listening to Chairman Guerin talking about these different things they're putting in place, and a couple other things we haven't mentioned. I mean, the idea that it's going to be basically up to offices, individual legislative offices, what their entrance policy is. Can you come in? Do you have to wear a mask to come in? How are you going to make appointments? Are you going to take appointments at all? How is that all going to work? That is, as well as issues like the press, as you're talking about, as well as, regulating public access, just who can come in and see the process, who can be in the building. All of that, I just think of it as a new set of filters on the process. And how, what are the implications of that? I mean, we are used to being able to just, I mean, not that everybody does this, but, for the organized interest groups, there's going to be no more capital, there won't be, right. From the sound of it, there won't be Capitol days, right? There won't be days where the interest groups organize their people and give them all the same color shirts and they travel around in a pack and then go visit offices. For people like us, you can't just say, hey, it's going to be a good afternoon to go down and sit in a committee hearing or go down and sit in the gallery and kind of watch what's going on. There aren't going to be any school visits.
And watch what's going on off camera.
Right. At a more, and watch what's going on kind of away from the ball, Right.
The fun stuff.
More, professional kind of, view of things, this is really going to scramble how the organized advocates in the system, the lobby, the public interest groups, even the grassroots groups, how they strategize, how they interact, how they shape the process. And so, I think if you take your average, interest group that has been, take your pick of the big major interest groups, and I don't want to single anybody out, at least not yet. My mood may change, but, pick a big interest group and say, okay, so like, what are their assets? It's a lot of lobby, if it's a lot of lobby people that can blanket and hit 80 offices in a morning because they have a big lobby team and they have access to those offices. Well, how does this change that?
Yeah.
If your advantage is you have a bunch of people that were former staff people and understand how the process works and can get into offices, well, does that mean they can't anymore? Probably not, but it does mean that will be that will be throttled.
Well, I'll say, you said something that actually reminded me, when we were having this conversation about what the Capitol looked like back when we were looking at the results of that House administration survey, there was a lot of discussion going on about this idea that every office might just have its own policy. Like, in the sense I remember now, the questions on the survey almost assume that. They sort of said, would your office allow this? Would your office allow? And it sort of implied that there might be sort of a piecemeal office by office approach. Although I would say, thinking back on that now, listening to the chairman this morning, that sounds less likely to me that it's going to be an office by office approach to sort of, capital access. I mean, again, access to the office might certainly going to be controlled by members, but if you can't get into the Capitol, it doesn't really matter anyway.
I mean, he sounded pretty, I heard him saying that they were really very much talking about an appointment only kind of model.
Yeah.
So that means that the implication of that would be that they are not going to close the Capitol off completely. And Chairman Guerin actually described, one end of the broad range of spectrum that he saw out there of opinion as being, shut the thing, close the Capitol off to access completely. He seemed to think that I took the implication, that would not happen. But what it sounds to me is like if it's an appointment only system in an office, there's going to have to be some way of filtering people at the door in which you walk in. And that's a technology issue. That's another technology issue, right?
Well, I mean, at its basis, it's a technology issue. I mean, at its most
Well, in
real,
execution, yeah. I mean,
right, in execution. I mean, what you're talking about in its most real sense, and you're already talking about this, but this idea that, not as though access in and of itself isn't a major resource here, but what it becomes is it becomes a really clear and obvious commodity, as there are only so many hours in the day and only so many blocks to
right.
have meetings, which become a lot easier to avoid, honestly. I mean, if you think about it, if you
Well,
can't get
that's
in the
where I
building
was, this, I mean, this is not this is like one of those adjustments like working from home where it sounds like, wow, how's that going to be? But there are definitely going to be some upsides. And the upsides are it's going to be easier to tell people no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think all things being equal, if you're a member, it's going to be easier to tell people.
Well, I was going to say that's one reason. Number one, it's going to be easier to tell people no.
Right. And so, in terms of what's interesting to me, I mean, I think that it affects the quantity of input and what that's not going to happen in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what kinds of responses do you see to that from the people that are seeking access? Right.
Yeah,
and writ large. Right. So does that mean increase, new means of increased use of technology? I mean, look, it's already a mark of access to, have members' cell phone numbers in your contact list. Right. For example.
Yeah. For example.
All right. So, my guess is, what's going to happen with, different kind of spaces that are outside of the Capitol, right? And so is one effect being that, there's a wholesale attempt to drive people out of the building, right? In a sense.
Right.
Right. So if you can't go to them, can you get them to come to you? And if it's not them, is it their staff, which is, already a precedent out there in terms of contact. So, I'm interested in how all those mechanisms and all those linkages and how those networks adapt.
Yeah.
Given the change in the rules.
Well, yeah, I'd just say, I mean, in like a really, in a meta sense, I mean, the value of the time resource has gone up significantly, and the actual transaction costs have become a lot more expensive. And the question is,
right.
who can bear it or figure out ways around it, right?
Right. And so then, we've talked about, I think the other institutional question is kind of tied up in this question of what the agenda looks like. And we want to talk in a little more detail about the agenda, but I do think that before you even think about the specifics of the agenda, there's kind of the institutional question of, does this hobble the legislature or not? Right. In some ways, right? I mean, and this could be, a self-hobbling, if you will. I mean, it could be that people say, hey, look, sorry, we just can't do much this time. And, there's the micro level we've been talking about. It's almost like, the micro political economy of this, where members are going, hey, this is pretty great to be able to not have to talk to people, for it to be easier to not talk to people I don't want to talk to because they can't catch me in the hall, they can't drop in. They have to have an appointment. There's only so many appointments. I have all these ways of filtering out input from sources I don't want to have input from or don't want to have contact with. But at the macro level, the more, at least up to the next level of analysis, there's the question of, does the legislature then in some way, does that make them more active or less active, more effective, less effective? Does it, how does it affect their the balance of power between the legislative and the executive branches, which has been obviously a very dynamic kind of institutional question in Texas for the last, 10, 15 years, as we've had a couple of successive governors empowered in part by partisanship in the state and Republican partisan advantages, but not entirely by that, working to strengthen the position of the executive branch vis-a-vis the legislature.
Well, and especially, and then, that dynamic that you're talking about that's long-term supercharged under the pandemic, right? Because normally, I mean, this is the governor's responses to disasters, and it's one thing when you're talking about like a regionally isolated hurricane or let's say a mass shooting at a particular school, but when you're talking about something that affects not only the entire state and country, but also obviously has impact on the economy and everything else. I mean, I think this is a very important question here, which is, to what extent does the legislature want to take on or have their say in more of this discussion than they've had. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if the answer is they really want to get involved, or whether the answer is they're actually happy to hang back and let Abbott, hang on to this. And you're right. I mean, then there's this other piece that overlaps with this, which is, how much is their own, the constraints they place on themselves, whether real or imagined, relate to this relationship. And it's a pretty open question, I would say, right? I mean,
well, it's an open question because I don't think that I don't think there's a consensus among the legislators about what the proper position is, right? And so, and it doesn't. I mean, obviously, there's a partisan difference. All things being equal, Republicans are probably more comfortable with the governor having a lot of latitude than are Democrats.
Well, Daddy has a lot of money.
Equal, but we know, anybody that's gotten this far in this podcast, and we both know that there are both Republicans and Democrats who feel, very strongly that the governor has overstepped during the pandemic, and that the legislature has not lived up to their responsibilities. Or at least has not been, at the very least has not been consulted enough in these kinds of decisions. And there are, points of disagreement about that. And the point being not that that's a, entirely or, automatically legitimate position, but that position is not just a partisan position.
Yeah. This isn't an institutional question, but it's just sort of an institutional feature that I've been thinking about as we've been talking about this, which is, this is really where you feel the pressure of the 140-day session every other year. I mean, you feel this every time around this time. I mean, this starts to happen and it ramps up and it ramps up. And everybody who's experienced this knows what the calendar looks like and feels like. But I think in a moment like this where there's, we know, I mean, we'll get to this now. I mean, we already know a lot about what the agenda is going to look like, and it's ugly. There's some major issues sitting out there. So this would have been a hard session no matter what. But the fact that, this point here that there's all of this, potentially pent up demand. And when I say demand, I mean generally. It could be from voters, it could be from legislators or whatever, for legislative action and to have a role in the state's response to the pandemic. We've been waiting for it now for, we're going to be having waiting for a year by the time they actually get their bite at the apple. And so it does, I think add a lot of extra, I would say tension probably going into the session, that maybe would be there with a more regular meeting body, right?
Yeah. And I think, it's going to be interesting to see how the governor plays that, and that kind of that is kind of a, you were raising the point, which I hadn't thought of before we came into this. So I'm crediting you, even though I'm going to jump the gun on it. But what do the governor's emergency items look like, and how COVID related are they when the legislature opens in an environment where the legislature, who knows, how much they're going to be able to meet, not only just what rules are they going to settle on, but, when the legislature convenes, it's very likely that it's going to be in the midst of probably a post-Christmas, outbreak.
Yeah, and I think
unless everybody's habits completely change than what we've seen thus far, which I never bank on, early January is going to look, pretty ugly. It's probably going to look about like it looks, now, if not a little worse.
Well, and based on what we've seen thus far from the public, there's very little reason to believe that the public reactions towards the pandemic are going to shift dramatically. I mean, unless we start having outdoor morgues like outside of Texas's cities that are on the news every night, it's hard to imagine people's, sort of orientations towards the pandemic, shifting too dramatically, so that even if the governor does go and put some sort of a COVID-related emergency item on the agenda, what does that even mean? Are you talking about shoring up healthcare resources? Or are you talking about helping, let's say small business owners weather the pandemic through, less restrictions? Because it's not going to be money, right?
Well, and speaking of the agenda and speaking of the institutional trajectories we're going to be talking about, it could be clarifying, the governor's line and the line of many, or at least, many of his allies, that localities don't have much latitude in this. And I would not be shocked if, the emergency item wasn't, something that said clarifying, the limits on local authority et cetera, et cetera. Right.
But it's funny, that makes a ton of sense to me, and I could see that, and also just to link this back to what you said before, that's also obviously not a right now thing. This is something that's been going on for the last number of sessions, if not before that, in terms of the relationship between the state government and the local governments. But I also think that's a possibility. You could see that. What I wonder is how does that get navigated if that's the case, given the fact that the governor has been the one who has sort of utilized the disaster declarations and his authority to such extensive ends over the counties during the pandemic. In relation to this question about again the legislative branch and the executive branch. I mean, there are bills that will. I mean,
they're already there.
Drew Springer filed an election-related bill, I believe it was Drew Springer, that would basically say the governor can't, because of a disaster declaration, change the early voting period.
There's a handful of those bills, and I was probably being not specific enough when I said clarifying. I mean, it would be more specific than it would be more like imposing limits on if that was to happen. I mean, I think you're right. That won't be anything immediate, but I mean, this is a good time to remember our basic point. It's we've been doing this long enough that it's becoming, one of the evergreens, to point out that, emergency item in the constitutional language, in this constitutional setting, is a technical term of art. It's not literally about an emergency per se.
Right.
There have been many non-emergent things, items put on the list by governors over the years. So, we're talking about.
It's going to be harder to do that in this session. I mean, just if you think about the idea of just putting up, let's say, a purely political item that's more about, posturing, I think it's going to be pretty hard to do that in a session like this, where, if you do only list, let's say, 3 or 4 items, and let's say one of them is some red meat issue, whatever, for Republicans in the state, given the limited session, given the legislature hasn't been in session, given all that's on their plate, I'd be surprised, but we'll see.
I'd say put a pin in that.
Okay.
Because I will be shocked if we don't see something about policing and budgets in the emergency agenda.
Well, let's talk about the agenda. Let's get to that.
So I mean, not in the agenda, but as an emergency item.
Yeah, I could see. Oh, yeah. Well, that's fair. Yeah, no, that's
so.
Okay.
All right. So let's talk about the agenda. So there are the obvious things on the agenda that are the big, the budget. So the comptroller, I thought, did a pretty, not to be in the tank for the guy, but a pretty masterful job yesterday of sending a clear message without a lot of detail.
Yeah, it's not as bad as we think, but it's not good, but I'll tell you later.
Right. Yeah. It's not as bad as it was looking, but it's still bad.
Yeah.
But, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Pretty interestingly done. And I'll be interested to see what the actual, what those numbers look like. But we know enough that, based on what he said, the numbers they did release about sales tax, and I don't want to, people know these numbers a lot better than I do. And some of them, at least one of them I know seems to listen to this podcast, but it does look like the swing is still going to be pretty severe from what was expected to be a more than $4 billion carryover to being in the red by an amount. And this is the amount that's still a little unfixed, but is going to be plenty, it looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, as of June, he was projecting a swing of, depending on, I think how you looked at it, between about 7.5 and 10 billion, right?
Right, and it depends on whether you count the money they didn't spend from the last session, and that.
Well, right, and
which they always do without including the money that they also didn't spend from the last session, right?
And there's right, because they roll that over. I mean, that's one of the big fictions of the balanced budget here. But then there's also, and John Engel did a good job of reporting on this at Austin's local KXAN station. There's also this money that the governor is still sitting on that has to be spent by year's end. That is federal CARES Act money, or CARE Act money. That
are we going to be getting checks?
Yeah, that they're going to do something with them. And one of the things that we've seen that I think people have not probably discussed a lot, but that as I've been working on some stuff related to federalism, is the idea that they have taken some of the money for education that was granted through the CARE Act, but used it to shore up existing shortfalls rather than to.
Oh no! Really?
Yeah, I know. It's hard to imagine that would happen. No. And so there's a lot of money still in play here, and the situation made worse. I mean, it's hard for me not to imagine, given what we saw during past budget shortfalls, during the housing bubble burst and the budget shortfall after that, the two sessions in which we saw big budget shortfalls, and what we saw in the short run, just in the last few months with the CARES Act, that there aren't a lot of people sitting around still praying for more money for the federal government and knowing that, something may well be there, but we don't know what, and that's a factor in terms of the change in presidential administrations, and that it's a pretty big unknown. The other issue, though, so obviously the budget is a huge problem here from day one. The other is obviously this is a redistricting session,
right?
And the Republicans managed to maintain a majority in both houses fairly easily.
So it should be no problem. Should be easy.
And we are going to have a redistricting, session in which there's going to be a lot of adjustments to be made.
Oh,
shall we say?
Okay, that's nice.
From the Republican perspective.
Yeah, well, yeah, you could say that. I mean, a lot of population growth, but a lot of concentrated population growth in Texas' major metro areas. So it's going to be interesting to see how they handle that.
But we do know that they, however they handle it, they will largely be handling it on their own and with less federal supervision than they've had since there's been a Republican majority in the state as a result of Shelby v. Holder and the declaration and the invalidation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, we should also point out that it's not like the Voting Rights Act doesn't matter anymore. There's still possibilities for litigation. There are other elements of the Voting Rights Act are there, but Texas will be redistricting for the first time in a few decades without a federal pre-check of the maps.
Do you think it'll end up in court?
I think it may end up in court.
Okay.
Yeah, so there will still be court battles given on how no matter how this is approached. I strongly suspect.
Right.
We have some friends we should have on the podcast that could talk about that.
Oh yeah.
And so redistricting will be there. Now redistricting is kind of that's been assumed was going to be there. I think there's still some question about when we're actually going to get the census data. And, there may actually be some court decisions affecting that between now and then. So those are the things that really are there, have to be done. I think there is there was an expectation out there a few weeks ago, I think, and I haven't really talked to people about it recently or read much about it lately, that a special session was almost certainly going to be required for redistricting, even without the in part because of the delivery of the data, in part because of all the other things going on in terms of the pandemic. But we'll see. But I think there are some contingencies there. And then below that, there's a bunch of other things. We've mentioned the COVID response,
right?
And it does seem hard to believe that the legislature can come into town, pass a budget, say in some idealized universe, for some people anyway, draw some maps, push them through the process, get them out, and say,
slash
okay.
the budget.
Yeah, pass the budget and then say, okay, we're done here.
Yeah, that's hard.
Brush it all from their hands and adjourn sine die without doing anything about that is explicitly targeted, that they can go back to their districts and go out in public and say, we did something to address COVID. Now, that means that there are subsets of other perennial issues there. Education, I think, being a huge one.
Yep.
I think there's, obviously a huge discussion going on about, the weaknesses in the education system that have been both created, new weaknesses that have been created, other older weaknesses that have been exposed by the COVID pandemic in terms of education. And, I think all things being equal, had we not had the pandemic, there was likely to be a lot more action on education as a follow-up to what happened in 2019.
When you phrase it that way, it'll be really interesting to see how the education portion of the agenda is framed as we get closer to the session. What kind of problems that were caused or problems that are more apparent now get talked about and what doesn't, right, at this point.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, the other side of this also just says, in a tough budget year, given the share of the budget that is made up of education, are they really able to do much more, besides programmatically? When I say, are they able to do much more from a funding perspective? I mean, it's going to be very difficult, especially after last session.
Yeah. And healthcare is another wild card here, in two aspects, I think. One, in this context, healthcare is a subset of the COVID response. Mm-hmm. And the economic fallout. We know that from the data that we've seen so far that, more Texans are without health care. There are a lot more Texans without employment, a lot more Texans without health care. Health care bills are going up for people that are getting sick.
It's literally the same thing you just said about education, though, right? I mean, the problems with the healthcare system, that were already there are much more manifest and much more apparent to people. But also, we are going to be dealing with the consequences of COVID, both in terms of, the distribution of vaccines, follow-up medical care for people over time. This is going to be a long and expensive problem. And it's to say, again, it's a similar sort of set of problems to education in some ways.
Right. So there's one bucket, which is how and to what extent can and will the legislature address the major issues that, in addition to the ones that, they have to address and the things that are always perennial. And then going back really to what we were talking about, these institutional questions and the input of the process, then, what about everything else that is the nuts and bolts in the normal business of the legislature? What about the sector-specific bills? What about, all of the things that the trade associations and, the people that, are, sort of 90, the old saw about, 90% of the, business of the legislature being about business.
Right.
Large and small. How much of this gets done? And if you're a participant in the process, what is it, what is the equilibrium once we see what's going on in the legislature? Will there even be an equilibrium? My sense is it's just going to be at that level, as we talk about it and as we've kind of parsed this out, thinking about what was in the panel this morning, the conversations you and I have had, I just think it's going to be a chaotic war of all against all, in a very unstable environment, in a very uncertain one.
Can you say a little bit more what you mean by an equilibrium? I mean, equilibrium between what and what?
Well, to my mind, is there an equilibrium in which everybody could agree and say, and we've been hearing some of this. I mean, this idea that, we're hearing more about this in the Senate than in the House, that there will be a limited number of bills that will be heard.
Right.
And, members will be urged strongly to prioritize a smaller number of bills for this session. There will be fewer committee meetings. There will be just, that there will just be an agreed upon reduction in traffic and everybody should cool their jets.
Right.
So the equilibrium I'm envisioning there is that, everybody kind of says, okay, our strategy is whether, and I think it's true probably from both the legislative and from the interest group and input perspective, social input perspective, that everybody agrees, okay, we're just, there's just going to be less traffic. Well, it seems to me that the moment you agree to that, people immediately begin to defect and try to game it and get their own things done on the margin, whether you're a legislator or a member of an interest group.
But there's so few cars on this road. Why don't I just hop on?
Exactly. Right. And so, I think that there's going to be, whatever that agreement comes to at some point in time, there's going to be enormous pressure to try to, game the system, if you will. Game whatever, I put it this way, game whatever agreement is made. And that's a very hard, I think, kind of economic dynamic to overcome.
Yeah. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention racism.
Right. And so in terms of the other things then, so then we've got two other big things then that are looming that, I think going into this, we would have expected were going to be on the agenda. And that's race and policing. And, it kind of came up earlier, and that is going to be on the table at some point.
I agree with that.
And it's going to get fought about. And, it's going to be very hard, I think, for both Democrats and Republicans for both left and right to not have some kind of item, to not address these issues in some ways. We've already got bills that have been, a cluster of bills from Democrats that, are aimed at racial justice and addressing problems with policing. You just had Republicans campaign, many on, supporting the blue and accusing the Democrats of wanting to literally defund the police. I just think it's going to be hard for that to not get addressed on both sides, and it's a wild card, and I think, look, there is and by addressed, I mean discussed, whether you actually see something passed, I think that's dependent on all these other things, but it's going to be, I think it's on the agenda.
Do you see it make it out of committee? I mean,
yeah, I think we see some hard, I think we're going to see at least one or two hard floor debates on these issues at some point.
I think it's going to be really interesting if they
But I should say we'll have to see what the committee chairmen look like, particularly in the House.
I think the juxtaposition, if the House or Senate goes along with sort of Abbott's initial gambit of basically, make it impossibles for localities to, decrease their police budgets, I think the optics of that are going to be very strange in what's a tight bending session in which, they're trying to cut their budgets at the state level. And also just from the sense of as a conservative legislature, the idea that, there's this one budget item that can never go down. I think it'll be very easy for Democrats, especially locally, to start saying, oh, so really what you want us to do is cut, mental health services. You want us to cut all the other stuff that we're actually saying we want to fund. So it'll be interesting. It's a sort of a separate discussion for another day. But but it speaks to the fact that a lot of political messaging is going to be around that. And so, again, in what's going to be already a hard session, that's going to be, it's going to be an ugly issue, I imagine.
Right. And I think the other piece that, we have to, at least consider whether, anybody does anything about this. And I, kind of go back and forth on this. I don't think I have a clear idea how this is, sort of election integrity and voting reform.
Yeah.
There were a pair of interesting kind of yin yang stories in the Texas Tribune by Karen Brooks Harper in the last few days. Day one was sort of, Democrats' eye possibilities for election reform. And then the follow-up story was, Republicans also looking at election reform, and underline the fact that reform meant very different things for different people in ways that are very familiar, to us. And that, and I still wonder if there is not some potential for some kind of horse trading on that, given that Republicans just very successfully increased turnout, which was kind of the hook of the day one story.
Right.
Right. But the hook of the day two story was that there are a lot of bills that have already been filed that are, within the more familiar pattern of, Republican legislators making it harder to vote. I mean, or certainly not doing anything to make it easier to, making sure that you can't make it easier to vote. I would probably err in the direction of the status quo on that, but I think there is probably a tiny bit of space for, a little bit of both.
I mean, it does speak to the bigger question, in some ways of, what is the interpretation among elites of this election? Both in terms of, the election in and of itself and where it sits on the trajectory of Texas's, electoral system going forward. And I think, to your point, I think that's part of why we don't know. I mean, if the 2021 dynamic looks like the 2019 dynamic, it could be that, voting reform and integrity in some sort of an omnibus package with horse trading is actually one way that members of both parties can demonstrate, their commitment to sort of, the seriousness of the integrity of, not necessarily the integrity of the election process, but people's belief in the integrity of the election system, which clearly needs shoring up. And if that's the dynamic, again, this idea that, hey, we're in a competitive system and we all need to look good, there's possibility. If the idea here is that, hey, Republicans have held the line, Democrats had high turnout and they couldn't do anything with it, so you know what, to the victor goes the spoils, it's going to look very different.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We just don't know that yet.
I think to step back then as we wind up, there's a lot more we could talk about here. There's a lot of wild cards here. obviously. As we step back, and and what we're really talking about is, what are the sources of uncertainty?
Yeah, I love it.
As we look at the session, and there are a lot of them, in the immediate run, we don't, as we've seen earlier, what's the state of the pandemic going to be in January when the legislature goes into session? They, like many things, and look, we saw this internally back in the spring at UT, frankly. You can plan a lot as things are ramping up, and then, some of those plans work out and some of them don't. And, it's a very uncertain environment. What is the federal aid that comes out of the Biden administration going to look like? What are those policies going to look like? And that broaches a whole bunch of internal questions at the federal level, that ultimately would land on Mitch McConnell's doorstep, I would argue, but we'll see. What is the timing of the vaccine? Where we're really focused on January and February right now. Well, what are things looking like in April and May, which is really when the action's really going to start. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now, but them gaveling in, and look, this is not that different from what usually happens in the session. Not a lot happens for a month. Frankly, there's not a ton of hearings, in the House, it takes a while for committees to even be put together in the House, et cetera. Maybe they're working on that ahead of time. What happens, and this was another interesting point about Chairman Guerin's discussion, what happens if there's an outbreak there's an outbreak in the legislature? How much shuts down? Now, a lot of that's going to depend on what rules they adopt and just how much, contingency is built into that. It's interesting, Chairman Guerin made it clear that they're thinking about that they're kind of assuming it's going to happen to some degree or another. So I guess, one thing that I would, that I think we want to end on probably is that, two things. One, so how does all this play into these established trajectories we've already been talking about? All that stuff is not going to stop. The governor is still going to be trying to strengthen the executive branch. Republican leadership is still going to see a lot of incentives on kicking around the cities and the cities and lesser degree county government. The state is still going to be growing, and we're still going to have all these big population shifts and generating a lot of problems, that grow out of that population growth and its nature, from, healthcare to a whole range of other things. And I guess that, just because we're trying to not talk about the pandemic at the state level, and by we, frankly, I mean the governor, who has said very little about the pandemic for the last month as things have gotten worse, doesn't mean that it's not going to have big policy and institutional implications. And I think, one has to wonder, as we talk about the uncertainty of the timing of a vaccine, about the intensity of outbreaks in the winter, if the governor isn't playing something of a waiting game and hoping that by the end of the session, this is really, things have between a vaccine and between the natural outbreak of the pandemic and the politics of public attention, barring the kind of grim disaster you were alluding to, possibly happening earlier, does it work? Can the governor kind of wait this out and assume that people, as part of the Texas model, will factor in the human costs and move on?
Yeah, and I mean, I just can't help but thinking about the optics of a Texas legislature that is, introducing plexiglass, potentially testing everyone, upon entry to the building, maybe requiring vaccinations and, limiting, again, basic, sort of constitutional
actually
safeguards.
Acknowledging the horror of it all.
Well, you could put that
threats.
actually, and you have that on the one hand, but, on the other hand, you have a public posture towards the state, which is, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
Go to work if you can, right? And it's one thing. I mean, the one thing about the Texas legislative session is, again, I do think the pressure of the 140 days is really, you can really feel it now in a way that I think it's there every time, but even more so right now because of all this uncertainty we've been talking about. But also, we have this concentrated moment of government in Texas every 2 years, and the idea of looking at all of these people taking the pandemic very seriously in their own professional lives on a daily basis, relative to the public pronouncements, that basically we're not shutting down the economy, we're not, basically having any further measures. People just need to basically behave themselves under the rules, and we're just going to go until we've cleaned this up. I wonder how long that's going to be okay. And I think it's probably going to be okay, again, from a political standpoint, the ramifications of it, but it does create a certain amount of exposure in your messaging and a crack in it.
And I think it does. And I think the ironic thing here is the one thing that could get them over the hump is the thing that got state government over the hump in the wake of the economic crash, and that's federal funding and federal programs, many of which go directly to localities and bypass state government when they can. And I believe that we will see, if they can get it through the Senate, we'll see a return to that in the Biden administration, all of which remains to be seen. So with that, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being here, Josh.
Yeah.
Thanks to our crew in the College of Liberal Arts and Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening. I guess this is where you really say, be safe and stay well. And we will be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.